So before I start with our welcome, I just want to draw everyone's attention to the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom window with the globe icon. If you click that, you'll be able to select the French channel or the original audio, so that if you wish to listen to the presentation in French, you'll be hearing our interpreter, Darcy, translating the presentation, which will be in English on that channel. And as you'll see, the slides are in both French and English today. So welcome everyone to the first webinar of the Integrating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Calls to Action in Nursing Education workshop series. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering virtually today from many of the traditional and unceded territories of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples in all parts of Canada. I am joining you today from Ottawa on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. The Canadian Institute of Health Research Indigenous Health Research Chairs in Nursing, or the I-chairs as we call them because it's a little bit easier, have co-designed and are co-delivering this 5-part series to support anti-racist and decolonizing practices in nursing education as a collective response to implementing the TRC Calls to Action. CASN is pleased to be able to present these workshops to support schools in implementing actions to address the calls to action, which is now included in CASN's accreditation standards. Before the presentation begins, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping items. So due to the large volume of participants, you will be on mute for the duration of the session, but you're welcome to use the chat to interact with each other during the presentation. You'll be invited to interact with the presenters and your fellow attendees through discussion questions using Mentimeter. So we'll be providing a link and a QR code so that you can access these questions during the presentation. We will have an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation using the Q&A function in Zoom. So you'll see a little Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. We ask that you don't put questions in the chat and hold on to your questions until the end of the presentation. You'll be able to see questions posed by the whole audience in the Q&A box, so we encourage you to upvote questions you would like the speakers to respond to by pressing the thumbs up underneath the question if you're wondering something similar, rather than posing duplicate questions. Finally, as I mentioned at the start, you're able to listen to the presentation in French or in English using the interpretation button and picking the language channel of your preference. And today's presentation will be recorded and shared in the coming days if you're not able to stay for the duration of the presentation. So the first workshop of this series is on the topic of Indigenous specific racism. And the workshop is presented by Dr. Holly Graham and Dr. Emily Blanchette-Garneau. So thank you very much, Holly and Emily, and over to you to begin your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be back again and to be able to do the second set of workshops and to have the addition of French. Pardon me. So before we start, I'd like to officially start with some words from one of our Gaelic knowledge holders, knowledge keepers in Saskatchewan. I just want to say a little bit about Judy Pelly. She's originally from Cody First Nation, was born and raised among knowledge keepers and wisdom holders and lodge keepers. And there's 10 in her family, siblings. And she's a Anishinaabe, raised primarily by her grandparents in sacred lodges, and has embraced the teaching of the many elders around her. She's the mother to 3 sons, grandmother Gokum to 5 grandchildren, and also as a residential school survivor, she brings her own personal reflection experience with her boarding school education that occurred at St. Philip's Residential School. I just want to kind of share one of her most recent awards. So the College of Education recognized Judy. She graduated with her B.Ed in 1985 as a 2023 Wall of Honor Alumni Award recipient. So she was recognized at the pinning ceremony and Wall of Honor celebration this year, April 3rd, 2023. She was one of the first students that enrolled in that newly established Indian teacher education program, ITEP, in 1973. And since then has continued to work in various capacities. And I'll let her talk a little bit about her experience and where she's worked of many decades. So I'm very grateful, and I feel that we have a lot of privilege to listen to Judy and to share her experiences. And she assists me with a lot of my work in Saskatchewan as well, with many of the committees we work together. So thank you, Judy, for joining us, and I look forward to hearing some of your words this afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Holly. I'm Judy Pelly from Cody First Nation. I'm a Saulteaux Anishinaabe. Very proud to be Indigenous at this time. I would like to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised on Cody First Nation, and the first 6 years of my life before going to school, I spent my time with grandparents in the bushes, living off the land, but at the same time too, I always like to acknowledge that a lot of the past injustices had already touched my people, or especially the intergenerational trauma, the residential school system. I was born to a mother that was very, very much damaged in residential school, and also my father. So by the time I was born, there was lots of alcoholism, and then so as I entered into residential school, we were forced to live to go there at the age of 6, and very, very damaged immediately. And I'm going to try and make this as quickly as possible. But at 6 years old, I was sexually abused in that school, and to follow that would be a lifelong journey of not being a healed person, being a person that was very damaged. And of course, and at the age of 12, I started to drink and became a weekend alcoholic. And as we sit here, I've been 23 years in October. I'll be sober, and I don't smoke, I don't drink. And I've so during my journey of healing, I did graduate while I was and then I ended up with a degree in a university. And throughout all that, it wasn't that I drank every single day. I drank on weekends, every Friday and Saturday for almost, I don't know how many years, 4 decades, and was able to graduate, and of course from the University of Saskatchewan in the Indigenous teacher education program, and started in 73 and graduated 76, and then went back in 85 for my degree. And at the time that I started my journey in education as well, I was always in middle management. I never did teach, because in those days you didn't have very many Indigenous people that had to post-secondary education. So when I graduated, I was able to work in middle management. Never did teach, use my teaching degree, but my degree led me to many good jobs, including my last 21 years at SIT, Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies. I became a Dean of Health, and in 2015, I retired from there. I retired and decided that, you know what, enough is to give the younger people the opportunity to work there. And so in 2015, the day that I retired, I asked the Creator to put me where I should be. Should I retire? Should I stay at home? My kids were telling me, like my grown sons told me, "Mommy, you're too young to sit at home. What are you going to do now?" And within 2 hours of praying to the Creator to put me where I should be, I got a job offer from the Saskatchewan Health Authority, whom I still currently work for in mental health and addictions. And so it's been quite the journey, but I've seen since 2015 is around the time where a lot of organizations were starting to hear about the TRC calls to action. And this morning I heard a very good presentation by former Chief Cadmus DeLorme talking about that as an excellent job telling those dark history and those historical injustices that happened to our people, starting in the 1700s and on to the Indian Act and so on, and then the things that happened since then, especially the residential schools, that was to destroy a lot of our language and our cultures, destroy us. Their aim was to kill the Indian and a child, so that we would not practice our language and our culture. And so I was very much a part of that era, like as a residential school survivor. But today I wanted to say it on a little bit more of a brighter note, that I do work with a lot of organizations. I'm also a independent contractor. So I work primarily with those that don't have a voice, those people that are addicted in mental health and addictions, those people that are living in homelessness, those people that many times have nothing to eat, and women that are being abused in all kinds of ways. And so with my lived experience, I work with people that are fighting with those addictions and so on. And with my life experience, I do sharing circles, and I work with people that have been in jail, incarcerated, people, women that are being coerced into prostitution, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and so on, all those injustices in the healthcare system. And I just was at a meeting with the city police yesterday, and giving the statistics of all the things that they're dealing with, and top and foremost is the domestic violence, and the highest in Saskatchewan, and in particular the cities in Saskatoon and Regina and so on. So we have, and the police, we work with mental health and addictions are their highest in their priorities now as well. So with all those injustices, it's intergenerational trauma, our overrepresentation in the healthcare system, in the criminal justice. It all has to do with that era where we were told not to feel, not to touch, and being abused. And I don't like to say that I don't want to be a victim. I just want to say that in a positive note, I've forgiven everybody that's ever harmed me, including my abuser. I pray that he goes to heaven, because for somebody to damage so many little girls, they have to have been very mentally disturbed, and also that forgiveness needs to happen. And then I listen to many people as I work in inner city Saskatoon with that population, that pain is followed by addictions, and so we need to heal to deal with that pain somehow, somewhere. And as Indigenous people in the healthcare system, and especially nurses in hospitals, we see still a lot of those historical, the injustices that have happened and that are still intergenerational trauma, and also the calls to action, to work with, to do things in a good way. Like there's Holly mentions a lot of time in anti-racism, all those injustices that have happened in the healthcare system, in the acute care centers especially. And you still see it, I still hear it almost on a daily basis, and how they're being abused, and how this nurse said this or that or the other thing. And we still need to open a lot of eyes. We still need to, people phone me on a daily basis. I went to the hospital and this is what she said. There was a whole bunch of white people came in after me, and they went before me. And when I tried to say something, sit down and wait your turn. And, things like that are still happening. And then even, but there's also lots of good things happening. My sister was in a palliative care here about a month and a half ago. She passed away, but we were treated with such kindness and respect from the nurses that were there. So it's not putting a blanket over everybody. even though that we still need to do, there's still the training that needs to happen. When I was sitting there and talking there, there's one of the LP, it wasn't an LPN, it was one of the nurses there that was the head of the ward. We sat and we talked, and I talked about residential schools, and she said, I've never heard anything like, I wish we could have learned, I wish we could learn these things. And myself included, I always used to think that this is just the way life is, like being with alcoholism, drug addiction, whatever, until I went to university. And it's the very first time in my life that I even ever heard about the historical injustices. It's not something we learn in schools. And Cadmus DeLorme was talking this morning as well, that he never learned. Why did his parents not do this and that? Why did they even though, because they never talked about it. And then he said that he himself included never learned about this until he was in university. So the good thing is now with TRC Calls to Action, it's being talked about, that everybody should know, especially those that are working with our vulnerable population. We need to learn to love and help one another. And in my prayers this morning, I included everybody that I work with throughout the day. I smudge and I pray at home, and that we all do this in a good way, and that we learn to work together as human beings. And more now with newcomers in our country, and we all need to live those. I always say the 7 secret teachings. If you don't know them, you could Google them. But most important is love for one another, respecting one another, telling the truth, and sharing our wisdom as we go along to others, and also the bravery and courage to say that, to have those hard conversations, those hard topics that we need to talk about, and with anti-racism, to not to ignore. If you ignore racism in front of you and it's happening, then you're a part of it. We need to all confront it and help one another as we face this, and especially with Indigenous peoples of this land, that we were original habitants, and all these things that have happened, and understanding that understanding needs to take place. That you should we should as people in a healthcare system promote that knowledge that people never learned, that we didn't have the opportunity to learn in high school. And especially baby boomers, they now they only learn about these things later on in life. So, we need to, it's a good time to learn in our institutes about that dark history. We can't ignore it. The graves, the discovery of the graves makes, over 1,000 across Canada so far. I don't know the number. My son showed me this morning. So it's real. It's not just a story that we made up to get more money, like some people say. It's real. The damage that has been done to us, and myself as a parent, my 3 sons became alcoholics. And like I said, I'm 22 years in recovery, and now I want to be a better grandmother to show the people that I work with that they can live better lives and be better people. So, and again, to remind people that none of us sitting here listening was part of that history. We weren't part of the damages that happened. We weren't part of the policymakers way back then. Johnny McDonald wanted to kill the Indian and a child. But we are here now to make a difference. We can make a difference in our own ways, and there's no wrong way. Whatever you can do in working with those TRC calls to action, and especially at 24, we're encouraging all nurses and to know about it, to be versed in it, to know what happened, to know why you're dealing with the overrepresentation of Indigenous people. Because once you can understand that, then we can all work together to get a better tomorrow for ourselves, for the people that we're working with, and those that are coming. Those that are yet unborn, that are good, we're always going to be here, and the finger that we can do whatever we can to work together. so with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I'll be here if anybody wants to ask any questions. And I could talk for 2 hours if I was given the opportunity, but this is, we need to, like I say, that what you're doing is good work across Canada in promoting this work, especially for our healthcare system. Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Judy. And I'm going to ask you to share one more story. Could you share the recent story with your niece, Isabella, and the ribbon skirt so they can have a context to how this day evolved?
Okay, so this little girl was my sister, Stella. Stella just passed away in March. This little girl, right? We need, this little girl was is my sister's granddaughter in our kinship system. The sisters and all our children were all granddaughters. So and she is my granddaughter. But and anyway, when she was 9 years old, which was a couple of years ago, she was in her school in Kamsack, which is the nearby town from the three reserves where I come from. Anyway, she went to school on December 18th was the last day of school, and it was formal school day, and everybody was encouraged to dress the best they possibly can, like you're going, formal day, and everybody in the whole school was just could hardly wait till they can dress their finest and show off the beautiful clothes that they were wearing, and then they were encouraging people to, and so all the school kids, all the way, right through the high school, we were all getting ready for this. And Isabella asked her auntie, "Can you make me a ribbon skirt? I want to wear my ribbon skirt to formal school day." So her auntie made her a beautiful ribbon skirt with some applique in the front, and Isabella was so proud of it. She slept with this skirt under her pillow, and she got it all pressed up for the formal school day. They could hardly hold her back. She was up at 6 a.m. already getting ready, matching up her clothes. And so Isabella, when she got to school at 9 o'clock, she went into the classroom, and the EA pulled her aside, and "Isabella, come here." Took her to the back of the class, and Isabella thought that she was just going to say how pretty and beautiful she looked in her ribbon skirt. She went with a big smile, raced across the room with the EA, and the EA took her in a corner and told her, "Isabella, you cannot be dressed like that. You cannot be wearing a ribbon skirt. That is not formal wear. This is not, you should be dressed like all these other kids. Look at them. Look at how beautiful they are. You should be dressed like them." Isabella, 9 years old, just so happy to be wearing her little ribbon skirt, where her heart was just shattered. She lived only 2 blocks from the school, but she cried so hard you couldn't even hear her talking. Like, she went home, and her mom, just shocked what happened, closed her door. "I don't want to talk about it." She said she wasn't wearing her ribbon skirt. She had it in a little bag. And then so her mother let her be, and then eventually was able to go in and talk to her. And Isabella told her the story about what happened. And at that time, my sister, the grandmother, called me and said, "Judy, this happened to Isabella," told me the whole story. And I was just furious. I was just, if you know her, she's the sweetest little girl you could ever imagine. And I'm so close to Isabella. And it just, you know what, it hurt me. I cried, and I made a big post about it. But I'm not a punitive person. I live the sacred teachings. I'm kind, but sometimes these things get to you. And then I prayed, I smudged them, and I felt a lot better. And then I wrote on my post, this is not about promoting any kind of anger toward anybody. But this 19-year-old EA didn't mean to cause her any harm either. She thought she was doing the right thing. So the EA, she did apologize to the grandmother, but my sister called me and she said, "We're in COVID lockdown, me and the Kokom and the Musham grandparents were 14 days in lockdown, so she couldn't do anything." She said, "Can you help us? You're educated, and you know how to handle the system. Could you please do something?" So this is what I did. I put it on Facebook that night, and then I was going to contact, but this is the last day of school, right? So I couldn't call the principal or anybody. So I wanted to call the school division, and which I did eventually. But when I put this poster, I explained on my poster how upset I was, and I went to bed. This is about 10, 11 o'clock at night, and then I went to bed, and in the morning, my son called me, and he says, "Mom, did you see your post? It has 8,000 shares, and there's people from all over the world they're commenting." And sure enough, there was people from New Zealand, from England, from Japan, from all over the world, United States, that had little comments all over about the whole thing, that they were just they couldn't believe that this happened to my little granddaughter. So anyway, to make a long story short, eventually I met with the school division, and they decided that they were going to do something about it, admitted that they had systematic racism in their school system, admitted that they needed to do something. And I reminded them, like, the teachers in those schools, this is only 7 to 10 kilometers from the residential school that I went to. Over 50% of the students in that school are Indigenous from the 3 reserves that are real nearby. And the instructors and the staff have never been given cultural sensitivity training. They did have an elder room, but none of, like, they didn't get, it wasn't mandatory that they take this training. So a lot of them don't even, like, in that school with all these kids, and we're so close to the school, you have survivors that are alive. I know there's a therapist there with a master's degree that's get these people to come in and talk to your instructors. And so I talked to the superintendent. We had a big meeting, and eventually Ottawa, the people from Ottawa heard of this. Even Trudeau acknowledged Isabella in his morning talk on a CTV News. He said, "I'd like to acknowledge a brave little girl, Isabella Kulak from Kamsack, who stood up for herself." And so this just went on. And then now, eventually, one of the senators took it to Parliament, and now it was passed that January 4th is National Ribbon Skirt Day. But since that day, people have been just wearing ribbon skirts like you wouldn't believe. So we all promote it. We thank the people that are. We always say do it in a respectful manner. And people have been asking, do you have to be Indigenous? And no, you don't. But when there's ribbon skirt workshops everywhere. But we encourage people not to wear them in a respectful manner, not into bars or casinos or anything like that, but to wear them, when you go to meetings maybe that are Indigenous, or powwows or functions like that. So Isabella now, she's when I was going to a Winnipeg gathering here just a couple of weeks ago, I met her at the airport, her and her parents. So she was traveling to Ottawa to speak there, and she's getting a voice, and she's now 11, I think she's 12 years old now, and she's starting to speak out a bit more. At one time, I was their only spokesperson, but at one point I told her parents, who are both university educated, that they needed to take this on, and it's not my story, it's your daughter. You need to start speaking out, because they're very, very introverted people. They don't even have a Facebook, or they don't go on social media. So eventually I talked them into taking this on, that they need to encourage their daughter. So they've been invited all over the country, and it really makes me feel good that she did bring light to the. So Isabella and people like the Phyllis Webstad, the orange shirt lady, I met her in Winnipeg when I was there as well. These things bring to light. And the biggest thing that I think is these are catalysts for change. These things don't happen by accident. I always think that the Creator put people together, and even these events and things that happen, they happen for a reason. We need to and not to forget those things, and how important it is to be aware, to know the rich culture of Indigenous peoples, and how we and make yourself aware of the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so, with that, if there's any questions, I don't know, Holly, how you want to handle this.
Thank you, Judy. I think we'll have questions at the end.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. Like if Indigenous knowledge and history is shared through oration, which is stories, so listening to stories and people telling stories. And I find that that is the most impactful way when we look at creating change, because when you can connect the heart with the head, I think that, you know, it just drives the meaning of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I thank you for sharing that story, Judy, because it is really an example of how many people, even though good intentioned, are just unaware sometimes of the words that they say and how deep the impact and that hurt goes with that. So I think it's a great way to start our series of, you know, why is it that we have to learn about, you know, these past, and specifically today is a tough topic, talking about racism and specifically Indigenous racism. I just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, just say Saskatchewan, I'm in Treaty 6. And I want to acknowledge Nehilwak, Nakawinawak, Nakota Dakota, Lakota, and the Chippewan, Métis, and Inuits peoples and their ancestors, just to affirm respectful relationship with each other and also the land. So today we're really looking at what are we going to do? So these 5 workshops, and it's funded by Indigenous Services Canada, and as mentioned, is in partnership with the 6 chairs and CASN. And it's really to provide a foundation to start. So it's a greater capacity for people to understand Indigenous Pacific and anti-racist approach and to reinforce those basic concepts of cultural safety and cultural humility. And a part of that is really important, is really to understand this history, this history that we have all inherited. And because we've inherited, it's a part of our current fabric. And more importantly, as Judy mentioned, is since 2015, the TRC Calls to Action, Truth and Reconciliation calls, there has been more awareness and more people are learning about this history. And specifically with nursing, CASN now requires Call 24 for accreditation to be required. And that also is part of the reason why we're here today, is to look at that and to share ways of beginning to start this process, to bring it into curriculum and to animate it and bring it alive. I just want to introduce the 6 Indigenous research chairs that were awarded across Canada. Dr. Lisa Broke-Bearskin, myself, Dr. Philip Beck, Dr. Garneau, Dr. Latimer, and Dr. Hickey. So these 6 chairs, we've worked together. We did not know each other before being awarded these chairs, but it's been a really nice relationship of getting to know each other. So I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit before I go any further. Is my Cree name is Pukamal Tixwo from Penishaw First Nation, Wasis. That's a picture of my mother. My mother attended residential school and day school. And this was one of the first events when they had Missing Murdered Indigenous Women special. So all the dancers had to do an outfit in red. My mother's a traditional dancer. She used to dance fancy when she was younger. She's now 83 years old. She's still with us. In terms of my professional background, I'm a nurse and a psychologist. I've been a nurse since 1985. Mixed ancestry, Cree and Scottish. I like to show this picture. It's a picture of my grandpa. Now, somehow or other, that heart got moved. I had it over his head, but that's my grandfather and my great-grandfather and great-grandmother on my mother's side, and then my grandparents on that side. And I just like to show that picture. My grandfather was someone who I was very close with and very much inspired me to go to school. He used to always put me on his lap. He never attended residential school. He was a very kind man, very deeply entrenched in our, I guess, our worldviews, our Cree ways of being. My grandmother, on the other hand, attended residential school, and she was very harmed and hurt and very traumatized, and she was not gentle. She was very angry, but she loved me. She always had a special place for me. And so they both inspired me tremendously. My grandfather used to put me on his knee and say, "What are you going to be when you grow up?" He used to call me the Holly. I said, "I don't know." And he said, "You can be whatever you want to be." So he was the first and the only person who used to say that. But you know, when you're little, it sticks with you. So I'll turn that over to my colleague to introduce herself.
Bonjour. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm happy that we are being translated as well. So hi to my French colleagues. And I'm Amélie Blanchet-Garneau. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a white settler of French ancestry. I'm calling today from the unceded and stolen lands of the Ghanaian Gehaga Nation in Tiohtià:ke, today known as Montréal. And I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Montréal, and I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse since 2004. So I'm really happy to be here, as I said, and my research program is really about looking at critical perspectives regarding Indigenous specific racism and the relevance of cultural safety and anti-racism in shifting clinical and organizational practices and policies toward fostering health equity. The big aim is really to dismantle white supremacy in healthcare. So I'm also a mother of 2 boys, as you can see in the picture. And I must say that dismantling white supremacy seems a bit easy some days in comparison to raising those 2 very energetic boys.
Yes, isn't that so true? I have adult children. My children are grown up. I have a daughter who's 30 and a son who's 33. And I feel very blessed to be a mother. No grandchildren. I have fur babies, though, grand fur babies. So when we look at the objectives of this first workshop, and there are 5 workshops that are part of this series, is first to really talk about the colonial history and how it's impacted Indigenous health, and to really understand how racism began and how it continues to occur. And then to really look at Call 24 and look at how can we address that. And I hope what you take from what we're saying through these 5 series is it really is about relationships. It's redressing, repairing, building, and creating relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The TRC Calls to Action were created for 2 reasons. One was to acknowledge the history of how Indigenous peoples have been treated in this country. And second, the intention was to create a Canadian fabric in which all Indigenous peoples are welcomed and a part of. And that really begins with changing relationships. And the other really important is just to understand how racism really does impact, how we interact with people in every capacity, personally and certainly professionally. So it impacts, things, our beliefs, our bias, and ultimately what the great concern is behavior, is that can negatively impact health outcomes. We want individuals to be able to reaffirm and acknowledge their responsibility to provide safe, competent care for all Indigenous peoples. And we would really hope that everyone would strengthen their commitment to addressing anti-Indigenous racism and discrimination in your practice. The TRC Calls to Action, there are 94 calls, and we've just put them here as a link. Specific to health, we'll be talking 18 to 24. And we're specifically focusing on Call 24. And even though we're just talking about Call 24, we really, as Indigenous research chairs, are addressing in different ways all the different calls. And part of this is understanding the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And those are also very important documents to go through. We won't be covering the content of that in these sessions.
So you've heard that CASN has a new accreditation criteria, and with this criteria, CASN is now requiring nursing schools to respond to TRC call number 24. We put it right there for you. So this is extremely important because what is learned and what is not learned will leave a powerful influence on how issues such as Indigenous specific racism and other forms of oppressions are dealt with in nursing, right? There's also a framework that was developed by CASN. So you are responsible for responding to this call in your faculty or School of Nursing. So to do that, CASN has developed this framework of strategies, and we hope that these 5 workshops will help you identify what actions are needed in your organizations and also give you the tools to act. Because action is kind of the purpose, the whole purpose of those series. Racism exists through every facet of our society. So racist and colonial practices, policies, and behaviors are fundamental causes of ill health. In Canada, Indigenous specific racism creates harms for Indigenous people stemming from colonial violence, oppression, negative health experiences, decreased access to care, poorer quality of care, and often poor health outcomes. So anti-racism aims to counteract the harms of racism, discrimination, and stigma, and mitigate the potential harms and lack of safety that people may experience as they seek help. So the goal is to do so by fostering approaches to care to help people feel safe, comfortable, and welcome. So I wanted to show you a video of people with lived experience talking about the importance of anti-racism in healthcare, but I think that Judy gave us a lot of stories to think about and to reflect on, and I think this was so powerful that maybe we could share the link on the chat, and I'll invite you to consult those videos. But I think what Judy told us earlier was so powerful that I think I would love to, for you to think about what was just said about, racism and anti-racism and how people experience that in the healthcare sector. If we go back at the basics, so when we call about the TRC call number 24, we really talk about engaging into anti-racism. So what is race anyway, and what is racism? So we know that concepts and ideologies are not neutral, and they exist within a social context that is informed by many interpretive frameworks and worldview. So while there may be some understanding that race as a biological construct is not supported by science, racism continues to rely on the construction of racial hierarchies. So for that reason, it's not enough to say that race is a socially construct phenomenon and leave it at that. So the concept of race cannot be dismissed because it is critical to understanding social oppression and unequal power relations. So race is a serious, enduring fact that requires sustained analytical and political attention. So it is a powerful force that shapes the attitudes and life experience of all people. So talking about cultural sensitivity, awareness, or competence is not enough. We really need to talk out loud about race and racism. And Baptiste mentions that race was created in the social attitude and beliefs of society. So it was not created in the streets. It was created by social scientists at universities as a product of the Enlightenment in the German universities and as a product of a particular rational and scientific projects to understand the nature of the world and human nature. There are many levels of racism. I'm going to highlight 4 of them here. Different theories are presented, and sometimes we talk about systemic instead of structural racism, and sometimes we associate systemic racism with institutional racism. So I've decided to use this model. You can use the one you prefer, but I thought that this would be a good start for a conversation. So internalized racism really lies within individuals. It's both within people targeted by racism, will come to believe that stereotypes and prejudice are valid, and also the people privileged by racism, those who believe in their own superiority without knowing it, right? Sometimes, or most of the time. Interpersonal, so it's when an individual holds and expresses negative thoughts beliefs or action about an Indigenous person or people. And this type of racism is the most visible. The institutional, or sometimes called systemic racism, is manifested through organizational policies, practices, and workplace culture that consistently penalize, disadvantage, or otherwise harm Indigenous people. So these workplace standards, norms, or regulation are harmful on their own, and they encourage and enable racism at the interpersonal level by creating an environment where individual actions are thought, encouraged, or mandated. So they're all forms or level of racisms are interrelated. And about structural racism, so those are the values and beliefs that maintain and reproduce Indigenous racism, Indigenous specific racism, including ideas that Indigenous peoples and knowledge systems are inferior, uncivilized, and settler-imposed systems are superior and inevitable and ideal. So these values and beliefs inform wider public policies, practices, and processes, for example, funding decisions, that influence and maintain anti-Indigenous racism at organizational and interpersonal levels. So structural racism is often the most difficult to conceptualize and recognize. So internalized interpersonal racism is supported by institutional racism, which is created and sustained by structural racism in the societal structures. I wanted also to talk a little bit about social hierarchies and whiteness. So the social construction of race is directly related to the perceptions that racial hierarchy exists. So viewing individuals and groups as different is part of creating social hierarchies, which are the foundation of oppression. So many scholars advance that even though race is understood to be socially constructed phenomenon, the reality is that people, including white people, are racialized. So it is crucial to name whiteness and make this dominant site visible and available for analysis. Otherwise, the honored privileges and domination experienced by white people are considered normal and are structurally invisible to them. So the difficulty that white people have, including me, in recognizing and acknowledging this honored privilege is actually resulting from this invisibility, which is so entrenched that it appears natural and normative. So while some white people may be oblivious about their honored privilege, this privilege is not invisible to Indigenous or racialized people. And white settler racism is a predominant mechanism for the continued colonization of Indigenous peoples and an important site for anti-racist action. And we talked a little bit about in Judy's story about the ribbon skirt. And we had that reflection about what is cultural appropriation. How can we know that we are appropriating another one's culture? So cultural appropriation, the definition is the acquisition of intellectual property, traditional understanding, cultural expressions, and artifacts from another's culture without their permission. So it is good practice for settlers to be fully grounded in their own ancestral history, ways of understanding and knowing worldviews and culture. Thus, when we are grounded in this history, it creates a space in which we can find commonalities without appropriating. So by truly examining one's own culture and being deeply rooted in the understanding of who you are and where you come from, you'll be able to resist the temptation to actively engage in cultural appropriation. You know, for example, can I teach about medicine wheels in my classes as a white settler? Can I wear a ribbon skirt in events where I want to support my Indigenous friends and colleagues? So I do not have the answers. For that, you need to find them for yourself and be aware that and be careful about using others, other cultures' traditional medicine or ceremonial practices, and you need to ask. So we were talking about the relationships. So building a trusty and authentic relationship with Indigenous colleagues will help you find the answers to all those questions that you may have about cultural appropriation. But I just want you to keep in mind that there is no one answer to all these questions, but you need to be in contact with your local Indigenous communities and be in authentic and trustful relationship with them to have to be able to discuss these questions.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And just another interesting story on cultural appropriation. I won't say the place, but at this particular institute, in their library, they have an honor song and a drum where an individual has taken that song and learned it and is non-Indigenous and now performs it at events. And when you look at our honor songs, there's a process for learning them and a gifting process, and even for carrying a drum. So that's cultural appropriation, even though that person may be well-intentioned. So it really is ask the Indigenous peoples in the territory that you reside in what their preference is and what they recommend and how they feel before just taking a concept and, participating and buying it and wearing it. Often I get this question is, why focus on Indigenous peoples? Why can't we be subsumed under EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion? So in fact, when I actually write EDI, I was the capital I-EDI. And the reason why we have to separate Indigenous peoples and they have to be separate from other initiatives when we're looking at equity and improving health access for all is no other group in Canada can claim the unique history that Indigenous peoples have with the Canadian government, and this unique history in which the Canadian government basically created practices as a part of cultural genocide and to remove all aspects of being Indian from all Indian people. And that is why we have to have special attention, special teachings, and education, not special, but designated, and ensure that this is taught within all curriculum, and why we cannot subsume Indigenous peoples. Because if we look at Indigenous peoples' health disparities compared to non-Indigenous peoples, and Dr. Barry LaValle, a Métis physician from Manitoba, talks about that when people come to Canada after 3 generations, they are enjoying pretty much the same level of health as the rest of Canadians, but it hasn't happened for Indigenous peoples. And so the question is why? And he shares in many of his lectures that it's related to racism. So it's really important that we understand why we can't subsume Indigenous under EDI, and it's because of this socio-political history. Before I talk about the impact of colonization, I just think it's always great to have a bit of a refresher. And I'm hoping most of you are already aware of this content talking about adverse childhood experiences. Dr. Folletti conducted this experiment back in 95 to 97. And it's not surprising to those of us who studied trauma, and I think many of us are much more immersed into it, is Dr. Barry LaValle, who was talking about those the health disparities. And what they found from the ACEs is that the more and greater numbers of adverse childhood experiences you've had experiences, and there's a rating scale out of 10, the more likelihood that there was going to be increased health, emotional, and social challenges in every aspect of Indigenous life, and resulting in early death as well. What is really, I think, important to know is that this is the longest longitudinal study that was done in North America, and it was done with 17,000 individuals, and it was done in California. Of interest is that, could you go to the next slide, please? Of interest is that most of the participants were white, middle, upper class, and they all belonged to the same health maintenance organization. So they were able to go back and see their health conditions as to what had happened throughout their lifespan and for what they were currently being treated for. And so when they went back and looked at their health conditions and then looked at the ACEs and had them complete these questionnaires, what they found was that there is this definite link between childhood trauma and chronic diseases that people develop as adults. And if you look at these diseases, these are the conditions that Indigenous peoples have very high prevalences in. And when we look at heart disease and diabetes, cardiovascular disease, we're looking at 2 to 3 times higher than non-Indigenous peoples. If we look at mental health and suicide, and if we look at the Inuit people, it's as much as 11 times higher than the rest of Canadians. So there's this link that's happened undeniably with people who are well-resourced, middle-class, white, college-educated when they experience these types of adverse childhood experiences. So if you take this knowledge of what happens when people are well-resourced, you know, what does that mean? What's going to happen if we overlay that with being Indigenous? So if you see the magic number is 4, if you have 4 out of 10, that's where the increase really starts to get serious in terms of the disparities. And so if you just look at, you know, depression increases 460%. We look at the suicide and look at the rates of hepatitis. So when we overlay this and we look at Indigenous peoples and we look at the impact of colonization and how this is related, and we think about what we know about ACEs, it becomes easier to understand why Indigenous peoples have higher rates of metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, and some of the other conditions previously mentioned. It is really conceptualized in the history of colonization. So it's unethical to talk about Indigenous health without talking about colonization. It's also important that we draw attention to doctrines of discovery, and I think they did an exceptional job of this in the TRC Calls to Action. And I think that is when many and more Canadians became aware that it's the basis for Canadian law, and it continues to impact Indigenous peoples. So it gave sovereignty or title of Indigenous traditional lands and territories to the Crown. And today it remains the legal justification for the colonial occupation of our lands and our nation. So as long as Canada bases its existence on the doctrine, it's hard to characterize it as anything other than a racist state where one race has been given the right to subjugate and confiscate lands of another. With this, initially, it was based on whether you were Christian or not, and Indigenous peoples were not considered Indigenous. So the doctrine of discovery made it possible for the Indian Act and all its genocidal laws and policies, including the residential school system, removal of Indigenous peoples from traditional lands to reserves, the criminalization of lands and cultural ceremonies, and the creation and later denial of treaty and Indigenous rights. And it just comes from a series of papal bulls, the formal statements from the Pope, and extensions, and it goes back to the 1400s. So this discovery was used as legal and moral justification for colonial dispossession of sovereign Indigenous nations, including First Nations in what is now Canada. So you saw the last slide as the population that North America had 100 million Indigenous. I think we need to slow down on the slides. They're a little bit ahead of me. So because they were not Christians, they were not human. So now we're on to Duncan Campbell. His statement was really, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into body, political, and no Indian question, and no Indian department, and that is the whole object of this bill. So I want to talk about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and some of the touchstones, and there's some things, obviously concepts that can't be covered, but really a bit about the epidemics, the residential schools, Indian hospitals, and just to mention that the 60s group and that there are more children currently in care than those that attend residential schools, and incarceration rates are higher. We have 4.9% of the Canadian population, but if you look at incarceration rates, both federally and provincially, Indigenous peoples by far are the majority. And then briefly about the Indian Act as well. The epidemics really was the beginning of social disorganization. Indigenous peoples were nomadic and they traveled in a completely autonomous group where they had their healers, their teachers, their educators, their medicine people, their hunters. They had everybody who needed to function as an independent society. And there's accounts of when they realized they were getting sick or infected, when they started to show symptoms, was they started leaving. And this was the beginning of the social fabric beginning to disintegrate. There's accounts Indian agents wrote that those who survived, when they saw the scarring on their face and looked in the reflection of the water, that they had died. So I'd like you to do an exercise of just close your eyes for a moment. And if you close your eyes, you're sitting in a room and you have 9 of your relatives with you. It could be your parents, your children, your siblings, whoever your closest relatives are in your life. You're sitting at a meal, could be Christmas, could be Thanksgiving, could be any type of function, but there's 9 of them. I want you to see their faces. Now they just died. That's what that would mean if there's a demographic collapse when 90 to 95% of the population died. That's profound when you think of how could you recover. And medieval Europe also went through diseases, and they had bubonic plague and much similar with epidemics. But the difference is they had 30 to 40 years to recover between the epidemics, where it was more like 8 to 12 for the Indigenous people. They could rebuild, restructure, and repopulate their societies, and they could practice their culture, and their traditional ways of being were uninterrupted. They could resume those. Indigenous peoples were disrupted. So when we look at which condition fostered more resiliency and which condition created and led and did lead to current health disparities, one can see that Indigenous peoples did not have the same opportunities to recover. We talk about residential schools, and that really was about cultural denigration, humiliation, and shaming. And those were standard practices. And it's been shared with the survivors' reports who attended the residential schools and many accounts that have been published. The feeling of that really deprived the children of their self-esteem and the root of really those lifelong feelings of self-hatred and depression. So we think about the self-fulfilling prophecy and how we view ourselves, and look at how that was so negatively impacted by the residential school experience. We know that it wasn't until 2008 where there was an apology from the federal government. Indian hospitals were created, and I think I'm not going to say a lot about them except that they were funded at 50% of the rest of the hospitals, and that when we looked at the Indian hospitals, there was just rife with experiments and unethical treatments, and Indian hospitals, Indigenous peoples initially were started to deal with TB, tuberculosis, and many individuals didn't even know why they were there. They were segregated from their family, and it was very much controlled to be admitted by the Indian agent. The Indian agent could just say you have to go, and if you didn't go, you'd be arrested. So there was no choice with the Indigenous hospitals, with Indigenous peoples being in Indian hospitals. And speaking of experiments, they did nutritional experiments, deliberate starvation. Of course, consent was not obtained, and they actually published the results given by Health Canada in 2000. And so I think that was perhaps where there was some recognition of, perhaps there was something going on more than the average Canadian thought about. And Dr. Dorothy Sam Williams suggests that the hunger, the nutritional experiments, and other experiences were contributors to abnormal First Nations relationships with food, and make that link to metabolic disorders, diabetes and blood pressure and stroke. What I do want to say about, before I move to the Indian Act, the Indian hospitals were funded at 50% of the budget. Education was also funded 50% till about 3 years ago. So until 3 years ago, First Nation schools were funded 50% from the public schools. And that is the reason I put both my children in French immersion, because it has the highest funding, the best funding. I wanted my children to have the best education. So if you think about First Nation youth coming from a First Nation school, their schools from K to 12 have had 50% of the resources that every other school in the country has had. And that means Indigenous children and youth are again disadvantaged when it comes to them getting into university and then, being able to pursue whatever they want. Many other challenges around education. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the inequities, not even equality in terms of funding for Indigenous people's health, but deliberate differences which have contributed. The Indian Act really it really consolidated the relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples, and there were many categories in there that defined limits of what Indigenous peoples could or couldn't do, what was legal, what was not legal. And one of the things I do want to bring to your attention was if you became a degree prepared, you actually lost your treaty right. You became disenfranchised. You became enfranchised. And this really detoured, and we think of the profession of nursing. The first nurse in Canada, Edith Montour, she was smart. She went to the United States to become educated, and she became a registered nurse. She came back to Canada, and she married a treaty man. And so because that was before 1985 with Bill C-31, she guaranteed her treaty status. Because before that, anyone, non-Indigenous included, who married a treaty man became treaty. So she was protecting her rights. And of course, that changed with 1985. So this undoubtedly had an impact on Indigenous people's health and particularly pursuing higher education. So there's been many amendments since 1876 when it was first passed. But it largely retained its original form, and it was administered by the Indian Northern Affairs Canada Department, also known as Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. So it has a long history of assimilation that's intended to terminate all cultural, social, economic, political distinctiveness of Aboriginal peoples by assimilating them into Canadian life. And so the Indian Act, and even with voting, Indigenous peoples could not vote. And if we think about rights as Canadians and the right to contribute and be part of the Canadian fabric, so they didn't even have the right to vote. And so the TRC Calls to Action is about what can we do to change the relationship with Indigenous peoples so they can participate in all aspects of being Canadian without anything negative happening. So prior to, a few decades ago, you could lose your rights, you couldn't leave the reserve, the Indian pass system. There's so many ways that the government controlled and legislated Indigenous people's movement in any aspect, socially, politically, culturally, in all those aspects. So when we look at the impact of the Indian Act, and we look at that book of 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, which I think is a great read, how have Indigenous peoples responded? And so really there's been this response of historic trauma, intergenerational trauma, disconnection, post-traumatic stress disorder, and some authors would argue we should call it response, post-traumatic stress response, because it's a normal response to an abnormal environment. Of course, the increased mental health and physical challenges. I talked about the social determinants of health, the funding for education until just 3 years ago, just being recently actually fair, like the same.
I think I might have a gala tomorrow night.
And internalized oppression.
No sense.
And of course, we talk about the unremitting personal collective trauma due to the demographic collapse that resulted from the early influenza, smallpox epidemics, and other infectious diseases, conquest, warfare, slavery, colonization, proselytization, the forcing of a religion onto a group of people, famine, and starvation. So there's no doubt that Indigenous peoples have experienced trauma. And if we look at even what's happening, this history of trauma, and we look at what's happening right now, we look at COVID-19, pardon me, we look at the unmarked graves. And my mother said to me, when we started the lockdown, she was very resistant. She said, I'm going to visit my family. She said, I'm still going to come visit you. So she would drive and park outside my house and we'd visit outside. She said, this is the closest people will ever come to know what it's like to be in a residential school where you're restricted. You can't go places, you can't go to restaurants. and all of the social isolation. She says, but you guys have Facebook, you have all your social media, you can text and you can phone. She said, so it's still not close, but she says, look at how mental health has been impacted. And if you can imagine for a moment what that was like for us. And they were children, pardon me, like they weren't adults. And we know the impact on children, more complex trauma before being an adult has longer potential for longer impact. So it's really important that we look at, and then of course the day school applications have been going in, and so that just brings up and resurfaces the trauma in many of those events because they have to relive them, they have to share them, iterate them, talk about them, and that's going on right now with the day school settlements. So if we know and acknowledge how stressed everyone has been with COVID-19, you think about adding the unmarked graves, adding day school settlements, and adding the re-traumatization of those who went to residential schools who have been re-traumatized by social isolation and some of those practices and policies. Even though it was for our health and the benefit for everyone to recover, it was still very much a trigger, is what I'll share from my family. Thank you.
So nursing is situated within and constituted by this larger social world, and is also shaped by multiple influences. So some of these influences reinforce colonial ideologies, racism, and inequities, and these dynamics continuously influence nurses' educational experiences and their experiences within the workforce. They shape what students learn and believe about nursing. So there are, I highlighted 4 dominant discourses in nursing and the health sector, and they align with efficiency, egalitarian, culturalist, and racializing discourse. And all of them can challenge the goal of equity and social justice. So one of those discourse is that colonialism is in the past, so we don't need to talk about it, right? So this is one of the strongest beliefs driving the persistence of colonial thinking and practices in nursing. Because it happened a long time ago, we have nothing to do with it, and it must be over. So the consequence is that periods of colonial history are not thought to be influential or relevant to modern nursing, and are largely absent in their nursing discourse. So despite its lack of logic, this view remains a cornerstone of the racist legacy of colonialism in nursing. Meg Gibbon says, nursing's grand theories demonstrate this erasure of colonial history, as if nurses can somehow create theories that are dissociated from the actualities of people's lives. This gives us something to chew on, right? There are also the equality and individual responsibility discourses. So we hear all the time, I'm a good nurse, I treat everyone the same, right? So equality is one of the principles guiding most Western countries' healthcare system. Equality discourse reinforces belief about the equal agency of all individuals, expecting them to be responsible for their own social position and behavior, regardless of the context and circumstances. In Canada, for example, it is widely accepted that all citizens and landed immigrants have an equal opportunity to achieve optimum health because healthcare is a legislated social policy, it's publicly funded, and it's a right. So the ideal of equality is often operationalized at the point of care with equal treatment in the context of presumed equal opportunity, with providers aiming to treat everyone the same. However, evidence shows that the life expectancy of Indigenous people and low-income Canadians remains lower than the life expectancy of the general population. So while equality and fairness are seen as important professional values in nursing, treating everyone the same regardless of their circumstance further perpetuates inequity by obscuring the unequal power relationships between patients and providers and by also ignoring structural and social inequities shaping people's life and health. So equality and personal responsibility are central tenets of liberal individualism and are still taught to health sciences students as foundational actions of most Canadian programs. There's also the efficiency discourse. So at the point of care, those discourses have shaped the language used by nurses and place emphasis on time pressures, care processes, and organizational tensions in a way that can compromise good practices. So this focus on processing patients as quickly as possible has also led to nurses describing patients in terms that suggest that patients are the source of the problem despite underlying systemic issues. For example, the use of terms such as frequent flyers for patients who seek care at the hospital often, bed blockers for patients who cannot be treated and discharged quickly, and failure to cope for patients with social needs. Delivering good quality care has been redefined in terms of managing and processing patients to reach targets among resource shortages, including time. And then finally, we have this diversity, multiculturalism, and racialization. There's a lot of words difficult to say for a French-speaking person here. Next time, I hope I'll be able to speak in French. So within most healthcare contexts, attention is also paid to diversity. So in concert with individualism and egalitarianism, culturalist and racializing discourses emphasize a simplified and stereotypical representation of cultural and racialized group. So culturalism is a form of stereotyping whereby culture defined very narrowly and often in stereotypical ways becomes the primary explanation for why certain groups of people may be experiencing particular health or social issues. So evidence also suggests that racialized ideologies and practices affect not only the administration of healthcare services, but also the delivery of services to individuals and the allocation of resources, training, and educational programs. So rather than focusing on anti-racism, the pervading models of good practice in nursing and nursing education focus on individual interventions with minority patients or students to assist them in adapting to the oppressive situation without trying to work on that oppressive situation, or to sensitize nurses and future nurses to the different cultural values and beliefs of minorities. So whiteness as an ideology and pedagogy continues to permeate the learning environment where nurses develop their professional credentials. So what does a colonizing healthcare system look like? Well, if you look at the Canadian healthcare system, you have a good example. So it actively and passively engages in point-of-care racism. It denies and minimizes Indigenous healing and the recommendation of Indigenous knowledge keepers. We invite them only as consultation, but never in decision-making processes. Failure to make cultural safety a national policy and priority in health and social services, or when they try to do, they do not acknowledge systemic racism, so there's no point in doing that. There's also a failure to develop national standards to integrate cultural safety into health professional curricula, and also a failure of health professional associations to systematically integrate cultural safety into their codes of ethics, so that licensure is linked to culturally safe practice. So it's not all the same over all the Canadian provinces, but those are a few examples of what you can find in a colonizing healthcare system. So many healthcare professionals design, often unconsciously, their interactions with Indigenous patients through colonizing images and stereotypes. And these dynamics becomes barrier to care and compromise the delivery of safe and equitable services. So this is what I wanted to illustrate with this arrow going from colonial ideology to discrimination. So this is from Ward's doctoral dissertation, and it proposes a trajectory leading to discrimination against Indigenous people, a pathway to harm, that provides a better understanding of the impact of colonial ideologies on discriminatory behaviors, whether visible or not, voluntary or not. So according to this model, which was inspired by the work of Jackson's in 2012, a psychologist, so discriminatory behaviors are the results of colonial ideologies, stereotypes, and prejudice. And this approach really helps identify where to intervene to interrupt the trajectory leading to discrimination towards Indigenous people.
So we're going to do just a bit of a case scenario, and I'm going to read it to you. Then I'm going to ask you to think about what type of harms have happened, and you're going to actually put your responses into Mentimeter. So I just want you to kind of make some notes, perhaps, then you can be ready to pop it. I think the Mentimeter number is already in the chat box. Is it, Christine?
Yes, we'll post the link in a moment.
Sure. So this is a narrative that was published in the In Plain Sight report. And so this is the story, and I'll just read it to you. Within the last 2 years, an Indigenous woman from a remote community in BC has twice traveled to a hospital in a larger center to undergo surgery for brain aneurysms. On both occasions, she has experienced racist treatment from the recovery room nurses. The woman describes waking up from the first surgery in 2018, feeling very unwell, needing to vomit, but with dry heaves. She recalls one of the nurses yelling at her across the room, "You're going through withdrawal. It's from all the alcohol you people drink. You'll have to wait for your booze." She says, she was subsequently moved to a different room for 3 days where she got no nursing assistance. These experiences have left the woman so fearful that she plans to refuse any future surgeries. She feels the risk to her safety is higher attending this hospital than it would be living with an aneurysm. She says she was treated in a way no human being should be treated, and is frightened that the lack of treatment could result in her dying. So if you go to Mentimeter, what harms are caused by Indigenous specific racism in this case? And as soon as you put your comments and responses into the Mentimeter, we'll be able to pull it up and we can just kind of see what is populated. Lack of trust, avoidance of care, pain, stigma, physical harm, emotional, possible death, healthcare avoidance. I think they need the code again. Someone's requesting the Mentimeter code. It's at the top of this slide. It's 28208591. Unprofessional, damaged relationship, fear and distrust, spiritual lack of care, ignorance, distrust of the system, didn't receive the care, subpar health outcomes, avoidance of treatment. Okay, and fear. We're seeing highlighted, people are really honing in on the pain, the fear, lack of trust, and physical harm, and death. So what I'm going to do is, while you're putting in your answers there, is we're going to go through, it's like the iceberg. It's mapping the harms of anti-Indigenous racism in British Columbia healthcare system. And so I'm going to show you an iceberg, but really the harms are, when you look at what can happen on the previous slide, what can happen is death, prolonged pain and suffering, medical complications, family disruption, community disruption, being taken, having to leave your community, refusal to stay, leaving early, loss of autonomy, not being part of your care, and of course the harm, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and physical. And then the wide reaching, that we can't really encompass, but other harms that are unspecified. So those are the harms that could happen. And if you look at this iceberg, I'm not sure why we have two up there, but it's fine. You can see that you have the interpersonal types of, racism that's causing harm, the organizational, and the systemic. I'm sorry, it's the French. I'm confused. It's the English and the French. That's why we have two of these up here, two icebergs. So if we look at stereotyping, it's treating as unworthy, criminalizing, insulting and ridiculing, not believing, microaggression, misdiagnosis, inappropriate referral, substandard care, delay or denial of care, differential treatment, culturally inappropriate care. If we look at organizational, I'm going to ask you guys to list all these now. We go back to the same case after we've kind of covered some of the harm, interpersonal, organizational, or systemic. You get, write those words in. When we look at organizational, it's just the inappropriate referrals, the acceptance of normalization of substandard care. That's the grooming of the staff. That's criminalizing inappropriate referrals, culturally inappropriate, harmful policies, practices, and services. That's a differential impact of healthcare gaps. Indigenous people's not meaningfully engaged. If you look at the systemic on the bottom part, it's really just the lack of resources and health coverage, the inequalities that are being created and perpetuated that impact social determinants of health. And this is really where the values and beliefs of worldviews perpetuate and maintain this Indigenous specific racism. So when we go back to this iceberg, and as mentioned earlier, the interpersonal is what we see most readily, so that's why it's the top of the iceberg. But underneath is what really sustains and perpetuates these ways of thinking. So if we go back to Mentimeter and do a take 2, what can you add to the harms in terms of labeling exactly what is happening? What are the harms? So we're not just looking for at the individual, but looking at the individual, organizational, and systemic levels. We're just waiting for some responses. It is the same question, it's just the take 2. It's just after giving some more language and terminology to describe levels of harm and the types of racism. So we're seeing misdiagnosis, death, suffering, further marginalization, medical complications, ongoing health disparities, organizational bias, culture of racism, prejudice, insecurity, grooming of staff. Yes. Yeah, so that case was just to take a little bit of a time to look at how the harm, the implications of the harm at all these levels, how it's perpetuated, and then the outcomes it has on Indigenous peoples, and ultimately how that contributes to current health disparities. Thank you.
All right. So what can we do now? Knowing all that, trying to work at the organizational and structural level. So decolonizing theory help us bring our attentions on those social conditions occasioned by colonialism and its constant companion, racism. So racism is a constant companion of colonialism because assumptions of racial superiority are used to justify and facilitate domination of Indigenous peoples and others, the people that are called others. So decolonization is really an iterative process rather than an outcome. It is done by questioning and challenging health inequities and striving for health equity, applying anti-racist approaches to care and providing anti-racist care, promoting cultural safety, and committing and engaging in this movement for the long term, and encouraging others to join as well. So this is really a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, respect, consistency, reciprocity, accountability with Indigenous people. And this is a process that requires constant unlearning, relearning, and reevaluation of practices, biases, and stereotypes. And when we talk about, cultural safety and anti-racism, those are really located into efforts towards health equity. But what is health equity? So it is about social justice and providing the best possible health and health care for everyone, paying special attention to people at greater risk of poor health. So this is different from equality. And this is also very different from what we see in the reality, as you can see in this picture. So to achieve equity means minimizing the differences in health outcomes between groups and supporting people to achieve their health goals and lead healthy lives through, among other things, freedom from racism, stigma, and other forms of discrimination, access to safe and secure housing, food security, quality healthcare, and positive healthcare experiences. So as we mentioned earlier, equality means that everyone receives the same care or the same things. Like equality promotes fairness and justice. However, it can only work if everyone starts from the same place and needs the same thing, and this is not the case. So to remove injustices, we are challenged to make better decisions about who gets what and how health and social services, policies, and are organized and delivered. So when we think about what we can do to foster health equity, Equip Healthcare has developed this model for equity-oriented care that could give us some ideas on where to act. So Equip Healthcare is a research and implementation program that involves health equity interventions implemented in a range of healthcare settings that could be also adapted to nursing education. So its approach to equity-oriented healthcare incorporates three key dimensions: trauma and violence-informed care, harm reduction in substance use health, and cultural safety and anti-racism. So those three key dimensions are interconnected, responsive to inequities, and tailored to each particular context. And 10 strategy can flow from these key dimensions to guide organizations to enhance their capacity for providing equity-oriented services. So I have the French version here, and the key dimensions and tailored strategies really aim to reduce the effects of structural inequities. So we're really looking at actions to change the structures and not only to change the persons. To change also the impacts of racism, discrimination, and stigma, and also reduce the disparities between mainstream care approaches and people's needs. So I'm interested to see, what are you planning to do next? So you're attending to this workshop series. So what is your plan for your next step in your organization? What is your commitment? What will you do? Yeah, call out discrimination, ask and listen. Read the book, 21 Things You Didn't Know About Indian Act. Learn more, reflect, and think. Relook at course content. Connect with local Indigenous communities. This is something that will be, that we really would like to see at the end of those series. If you're able to connect with local communities, these will be your best allies to work with. Learn and unlearn. Suggest change to the curriculum. So that's great. So we see many actions that are directed towards changing things in the long term, not only putting a band-aid on the situation. That's great. So if you're a settler, I would recommend to think and learn about what is allyship and what is an ally and how can you become an ally. So there is a quote from Lila Watson on allyship that suggests a commitment to a movement of solidarity on the part of settlers, and the vulnerability and an intention toward mutual liberation. So to be an ally is not just a matter of being motivated and not causing harm or doing your best. I hear this all the time. I'm really doing my best. So to embark in the path of allyship is really to engage in an active process of decolonization. But how do we get started? So we did a lit review, and we are actively thinking at the Quebec chair about what is allyship and what does it mean. And I think that comes from my own position as a settler in this work. And we've been working with 2 Indigenous master students and 1 non-Indigenous student, and a white settler as well. So we did a lit review, and that was really interesting. So in the lit review, we found that to become an ally, we need to build relationships. So this is the first step. We need to build relationship. And I would put that in the plural form. And we mentioned that earlier, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is really important. Build a really trusty, authentic, reciprocal relationship with your local Indigenous communities. Learning in discomfort. So to be a settler is really requires us to consciously reflect on our identity as a member of a dominant group, and also to reflect on our privilege, power, and heritage. Whiteness is something that we cannot escape from, but we need to work with. So critical self-reflection is not easy, but it's necessary to become a settler ally. It entails active and ongoing mindfulness of one's thought, action, and behaviors, and always questioning everything. Be an ally, not claiming to be an ally. That's an important thing to, as a settler working with Indigenous colleagues towards more equity, towards dismantling white supremacy, I cannot say that I am an ally, because this is a messy posture. It's not fixed. It's not settled. It's constantly evolving. And it is something that requires a constant cycle of questioning, recognition, and self-reflection. And part of the danger is that being an ally may insinuate that it is an end goal, but this is not. You know, when you say I'm an ally, this is how it sounds. This is not an end goal. This is something that changes all the time. We cannot achieve that status. It's not something that can be achieved. It's the continued questioning and constant unsettling that is part of the role. And then in taking action, it's really to show up, be there, and taking concrete actions. It's a position that can be difficult to take because of the discomfort it brings. But it is really important to show up, change settler narratives, intervening in microaggressions, challenging hegemonic knowledge. So it can be difficult to know how to position yourself, you know, who's an ally and who gets to decide. If you're an ally, are you always an ally, and for how long, in what context? So there's no fixed answer to that. And allyship is a really deep reflection that I think settlers, we need to have all the time, and position ourselves in the work, and what are the limits of what we can do and where we can be, and to make sure not to take the space that do not belong to us or that should be taken by somebody else. Now, if you want to work on at the organizational level, there are a few tools that were developed by UNDRIP that I like to use. For example, this worksheet is to assess your own organization in terms of the strategies related to addressing Indigenous specific racism. So the goal of this tool is really to support a conversation among all staff to optimize the organization's actions and capacity for equity-oriented services. Here's another tool that you can use, and it's linked to a video that you can watch online if you'd like. So after doing the rating your organization exercise, you can do an equity walkthrough. So UNDRIP has developed a set of questions that guide you to see and think from an equity perspective as you physically move to your work environment. So most of these questions can be applied in various work environments, including faculties and schools of nursing. And it's really adaptable in countless ways. So there is a video online that you can watch if you want to understand better what it means to do an equity walkthrough and who should do an equity walkthrough with whom and what are the questions you can ask yourselves. You could also conduct a brief SOAR analysis to help you and the people working at your organizations to collectively anticipate and predict where the areas of disruptions will occur in your organization. And so this is a typical SOAR analysis. You may have seen that before in your life or not, but it's all available free online. And the three tools that I just presented will help you to take stock. So this is the step 0 in this little picture. That means getting an initial sense of where your organization is at in terms of equity. And the next step would be committing leadership, because without leaderships, we cannot ensure that the organization will take action, right? So the next step will provide the path and link you to useful also resources and tools that are available online. One thing that I like about this action kit roadmap is there are also tools around the questions of anticipating and countering resistance and also embedding accountability mechanisms into your organization. So those are two places where it's very, it may feel very difficult to navigate. So there are interesting tools that we can use around those questions as well. So implementing equity-oriented care happens both at the individual and organizational levels, but can start with anyone. So the tools that are available and provided by UNDRIP are broadly useful, whether you're an individual educator or you're at the leadership position. And they are really designed to support new ways of thinking and embedding existing realities. So I think this is all we had to talk with you today about, and we will welcome questions and comments now. I don't know, Holly, if you have final thoughts you would like to share before we move to questions or comments.
I guess that one slide has been removed. I just wanted the one content, not the whole slide removed. I was just going to draw their attention to the PPG group.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
we have some questions in the Q&A. I can read them out if we're ready. Okay. Wonderful. So this is from Heather. She asks, as we create awareness within our students, how are we as educators going to address the system problem in the current nursing staff who will be unteaching or remodeling behaviors of our students? Shouldn't university recommendations for call to action also require this education for preceptorship nurses, student mentors, and for general licensure recertification, similar to jurisprudence? to promote self-reflection and accountability within licensure at the frontline and system level. Just wondering if there's also conversation within the licensing bodies.
I can start to answer that. I'm just putting this PPG group. Someone had wanted to know what that was. In Saskatchewan, what is happening here is the College of Registered Nurses Saskatchewan has started a working group to address racism in healthcare. And as part of doing the response to TRC Call 24, they're writing a competency and just taking it through the process. And this competency will be what will be required for accreditation for the nursing schools in Saskatchewan. And so that's a beginning step. And I think much else of the question of changing attitudes. The other thing we're doing in Saskatchewan is September 30th, launching a public service announcement that's been created by our nursing leaders in the province, deans of all our nursing institutions, standing up about racism in healthcare, and responding to TRC calls to action. And Judy Pelly is actually a part of that. So that will be released. So in our province, we're doing as much as we can to educate. I've started a professional practice group, which I put the link in the box here. And that is a professional practice group for Indigenous nurses in Saskatchewan. Indigenous nurses can join outside Saskatchewan. It has resources regarding content, and if people want to know what they need to understand about nursing and reconciliation or residential schools, it's just a quick reference of a website, the resources that I have reviewed. So it's in the chat box now. Let Amelia respond to that as well.
Yeah, I think that when we look at the literature, and this is also what we're working on at the Quebec chair, is really like train the trainer modules and exactly developing anti-racism practice at the preceptorship educators level. This is also one of the first steps along with organizational changes if we want to make sure that our actions align with what we're saying that we promote in nursing. So this is exactly what we're looking at. And also the Quebec Order of Nurses, we issued a position statement along with recommendations for actions in different domains of the nursing practice. And so this is happening at the Quebec Order of Nurses. And I know this is also happening in other legislation bodies around Canada, but if it's happening in Quebec, it's probably happening everywhere else, right? I'm saying that because we still need to acknowledge systemic racism, which the Quebec Order of Nurses did publicly acknowledge systemic racism, anti-Indigenous specific racism.
The other thing we're doing in Saskatchewan, the CRNS is working on an apology that will be on their website to all Indigenous peoples for past practices, and then a commitment to current and future practice. So creating a lot of awareness. I think what we have to be very mindful is this information was not taught in K-12, and only 20% of Canadians go to university and obtain a degree. So many Canadians do not have this history, do not know this history. And even when I was educated, we did not learn anything about this when I was doing my basic nursing training. And I didn't actually have the opportunity until I did my master's and my PhD. So when we talk about what can we do to change the culture, education awareness is the first step. And I think encouraging people to read the TRC Calls to Action, the whole report, and the survivors speak out, their responsive residential school is a really good starting place and space, is to create that awareness and knowledge so that we know what it is we have to start restoring and repairing as we work together. So I really hold compassion. Even myself, my mother never talked about being in residential school. And so it was not something that was spoken about. And it's just something I think many Canadians and since Denmark raised can no longer deny. And for many, that's the first time that they've sought out this type of knowledge.
Wonderful. I'll read up the next question. This is from Caitlin Campbell. They say, I recently had someone, a settler in brackets, tell me they don't like the term settler because they were born in Canada and their family had been here for generations. They felt it was a divisive term. I felt that this is an expression of white fragility. I wonder if any presenters have recommendations/suggestions on how to turn a conversation like this into a productive one.
I'll let Amelia answer that one.
Thank you, Holly. Well, I heard that too. And this is exactly a good example of how we erase the colonial history from our discourse and the words that we use. So I think that, one way of putting this into a productive conversation is really to ask more about, so how would you call yourself and how would you acknowledge this history that is part of Canada? So if you don't like the term settler, how would you do this? And ask, and so that would open the conversation without, blaming the person for not liking the word. I hear that all the time. And also people don't like to talk about racism as well, because they feel it's a violent term. I said, well, yes, it kills people. So, but really, I think the idea is really to make the people talk about what are their beliefs and what does that come from, this discomfort, where does that come from, and how they are planning to act to acknowledge this colonial history that we need to act upon, right?
Yeah. And can I just add that I did get a formal complaint against my professional license that someone wrote a letter because they're upset at the term white settler in the demographic for training I provided, and they wanted my license removed. So that was really harsh and upsetting. Of course, it was not considered professional misconduct and nothing happened to my license, but it does upset people. And I was deeply disturbed by that because I thought my relatives are dying and none of them are writing letters because they're dead. And not to laugh about it or make light of it, but sometimes I do have to laugh because it is very painful.
Yeah. I'll read the next question. So this one says, one difficulty we are encountering is that there are not a lot of Indigenous educators in our area, so finding people to teach our students this content is a challenge. What are the recommendations in regards to dealing with a lack of Indigenous involvement in the curriculum delivery while still aiming to meet the TRC Call to Action 24?
That is really challenging, and it's true. We don't have enough Indigenous educators. And I think that's why it's really important that we work together. And part of it is, we have created these workshops to assist with that. But one of the things I would reach out to community. You don't need to be nurses to teach the history of what happened to Indigenous peoples or the challenges in healthcare. So if you absolutely have no Indigenous nurses, you will have Indigenous peoples in your surrounding areas that you can reach out to and get connected. And if you connect to Indigenous nurses, they can often refer you to someone in your area that they know through their network. So I think what's really important is anybody can teach the history of colonization. All Canadians should know this history, whether you're Indigenous or not. So that part should not be a challenge. But when it comes to cultural teachings and wisdom and cultural knowledge, Indigenous peoples should be teaching the advocacy and the knowledge keepers. And that's the people you'll only find through extending your family, your circle of friends, and your relationships.
And then I'll answer the last question that we have here. Genocide is another term that, although applies to our history here in Canada, we still choose not to use and instead use the term colonial history or other terms. What is your thoughts on this?
I use it often. I just didn't use it today. It's something I freely and commonly use.
Yeah, I think when we want to practice anti-racism, we name the things, we name the realities as they are, and we don't try to, circumvent, and we jump in the discomfort, right? So and then we have to deal with the discomfort. But I think using the words that are describing our realities, the right words, is really, really important to anti-racism work.
I'll read this other question from Michelle. It can be really challenging to have open discussion with groups of nurses who may not be open to talking about the impact of colonization. Defensive responses are so common in these spaces. Do you have any recommendations to help minimize defensive responses when educating on the history of this nation and history of healthcare in relation to colonization?
Can I just say that's why I created the PPG website, is so that people can go there and read. I know when I was doing my PhD and I took my first theory and practice of anti-racist education, half of us were Indigenous and half of us were not. And we cried every night class because we didn't know this history. So it was so good we read it, prepared it, and came together to discuss it. So I think people need an opportunity to read this in isolation, just to start processing before they come together and talk. A lot of my colleagues who are First Nation, they say it's so difficult, to explain the history, and it's emotional, and it's hard on Indigenous peoples to go through that history because it's painful. So I say, now that we have the website, why don't you just tell them, go to this website, you want to learn about the history. Once you've read a bit, then come back and we can have a conversation. And so that's some of the hopes, I guess. But it is tough. And people are only ready when they're ready.
It's also a systemic issue, right? We are not individually responsible for all this happening, but we need to work together and do something about it, right? So that's also, feelings of guilt and shame are really common when people hear about the history of Canada, which they should not be hearing about at the university level, right? They should be hearing that from K to 12, but this is not what's happening yet. So I think it's also putting that in terms of, so what do we do now? What can we do, to change the things, because we have the power to do that. So how can we do that? Shift a little bit the discourse around shame and guilt, and use that energy towards action or something. Yeah.
Those are all our questions for now, and we're on the hour. So if no one else has any questions, we can wrap it up. See any final words?
There is one question, Lois. It comes from Peggy.
Okay.
One of the topics that comes up in nursing education is the health disparities that occur in Canada for Indigenous persons, such as heart disease, diabetes, and TB. Is it okay for a white settler to highlight as an educator these health disparities for students, or should this information be delivered by an Indigenous educator? I would say all nurses need to know this information, but you have to root it in the context of colonization and why those health disparities have evolved versus just diving into these health disparities without providing a context. Because otherwise people would just think they're just making unhealthy choices. They need to walk more, eat better, sleep better. And it's so much more than that. Thank you for that great question.
If we have no more questions, I just wanted to extend wonderful thanks to knowledge holder Judy Pelly, Holly Graham, and Amélie Blanchet-Garneau for joining us today. Thank you for all the knowledge that you shared and your collaboration, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's always an honor to be asked to and do some opening remarks. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Jilly.
I'll stay on, Amelia.